guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I'm going to bring you my March wrap-up. So this month was a really good month for reading for me, which seems so strange because I feel like I just haven't really read anything in ages, but that's clearly not true because I read 12 books this month. That sounds like a lot, and it is, but it was a combination of graphic novels, which I read really quickly, very sort of short stories and short format books, and just really quick reads. So there's a lot to get through, so I'm just gonna get started now. So the very first book that I read this month is Children of Blood and Bone, and this is by Tomi Adeyemi. If you haven't heard about Children of Blood and Bone by now, you are probably not part of the book community online because this book has been huge, and it came out this month. There's been so much hype surrounding it for the past year or so, ever since she sold her manuscript, and I was really excited to get going on this. I really wanted to see if it was worth the hype, and I'm really happy to say that it very much was. Children of Blood and Bone is a West African-inspired young adult fantasy. It follows the character of Zaylee, who is a girl who's part of a sort of tribe that used to be able to perform magic, but now magic has left the land and they've essentially been conquered. One day Zaylee finds out through a series of events that she can bring magic back into the world, sort of bring her people back up again. So she goes on this sort of wild adventure to try to restore magic to the land. So if you have heard about this book, you've probably heard about the hype, these insane hype surrounding it, and I have to say that, again, it is absolutely worth it. It's worth your time, regardless of whether you are a young adult fantasy reader or an adult fantasy reader, or if you just want something that's a little bit different. This book is amazing, it's incredible, the world building, the characters, the plot, the pacing, everything. I really love this. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I'm intending to do a review of this at some point, but it's been a month since I read it, and I still can't quite put into words how much I enjoyed this, so I hope that says something about how good it is. So keeping in the vein of young adult fantasy, the last book that I read this month is one that I have been working on all month. It's a little bit slow to start, but it was absolutely worthwhile in the end. So this is The State of Sorrow by Melinda Salisbury. So I have read the very first in her other trilogy called The Sin Eater's Daughter, and I really enjoyed it. I like the way that she uses language, and I like her heroines. I think that they're really interesting young adult fantasy heroines because they're not, you know, going out there kicking ass and taking names. They're very quiet and they're very strong in their own way, and I really enjoy that. However, I do find that sometimes her writing can be a little bit on the slower side, so I really need to be in the right mood to read her books. So State of Sorrow is about a girl named Sorrow who is 18 years old, and 18 years prior, her older brother died in a very tragic accident. So her family is sort of the ruling family of her land, and after her brother's death, her father just went into this horrible state of depression and ended up forcing the entire land to be in this sort of state of perpetual mourning. So her father is completely useless running this kingdom into the ground, and so she decides that she is going to step up and take power, essentially seize power from her father. There's a lot of politics in this book and there's a lot of intrigue, but because there is this huge setup, it doesn't really get going for about 160 pages. Right around that mark, I felt the main plot started to get going, we had things established that we needed to know, and then things really began to move forwards. I ended up really enjoying this book. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. So moving from young adult to adult fantasy, this was actually the pick for my fantasy book club for the month of March. I had bought it. I didn't know much about it, but I knew that it's quite a popular book in the adult fantasy circles. So I didn't know anything about it going in. I basically only read it because it was going to be my book club's pick, and I ended up absolutely loving it. So this is City of Stairs by Robert Jackson Bennett. So I have been trying to explain the plot in the background of City of Stairs for about 5 minutes now, and it's just not working out. What I will say is that it is basically a very tense political novel between the sort of conquered nation and the conquerors, which happen to have been switched at one point in history. The people who were being oppressed rose up and conquered the conquerors. This book focuses on the murder of a historian who is coming through and sort of investigating the history of this place that they have ended up conquering. They bring in this sort of brilliant young agent named Shara, and Shara goes through and is investigating what happened and ends up uncovering so much. There's so much here, I just cannot summarize it all. However, it is a beautifully plotted novel, it is an incredibly well-paced novel, and the characters are incredible. It's very, very funny. I loved everything about this book. I loved it so, so much. I'm actually planning on reading the rest of the trilogy, which is complete at this point. This is really one of those books where I sit there and go, why the hell haven't I read this sooner? It's been sitting on my shelf for like 3 years. I'm not kidding. So next up on this list is a very short book, but it is one that I have been really interested in for a long time. This is actually nonfiction. So this is Women in Power by Mary Beard. If you don't know who Mary Beard is, she is a very sort of popular, famous classicist here in the UK. This particular book is adapted from a couple of her lectures, and it's split into 2 parts, but essentially it's about sort of the history of women and power and how women have been silenced throughout history, starting from ancient Greece and Rome, which is where she sort of specializes, and coming through to the modern day, where a lot of these ideas have come from. It covers a lot of ground for such a tiny book. It's like 150 pages long, and I thought that it was a really, really good read. There are parts of it that are going to make you laugh out loud, and there are parts of it that are going to make you very, very angry. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I have 2 books. Well, I say books, but they are incredibly, incredibly tiny. So I have 2 of the Little Penguin 1-pound classics. So I have Daphne du Maurier's The Breakthrough, and I have Shirley Jackson's The Missing Girl. So first, Daphne du Maurier's The Breakthrough. It says on the back, a scientist's attempt to solve the mystery of life after death has chilling consequences in this eerie tale from a virtuoso writer of suspense. So if you don't know who Daphne du Maurier is, she wrote the book Rebecca, which is a very, very famous book that's become a very, very famous movie. So I have never actually read any of Daphne du Maurier's books, despite the insistence from my family that I should really do that. This was sort of my first taste of her work. It's a very short story. It's about 57 pages long, which is about where these classics seem to average. And I feel like this is a really good place to start with her, as I did, because you get a taste of what her writing is like. It's so short. I don't want to say too much about it because I feel like if I do, I'll just give everything away. But I really liked the sort of scientific ethics that she goes into in this book, and I really liked the sort of sci-fi quality that this book had, which is not something that I was necessarily expecting. I basically picked it up because it's Daphne du Maurier. I believe I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. The reason for that is because I just don't really do well with short stories. I feel like I really need them to be fleshed out a little bit more. So I feel like I would have loved this as a full-length novel, but I really, really wish that I had more of it. So I ended up giving it the 3.5. Next up is Shirley Jackson's The Missing Girl. So this is actually 3 short stories in one very, very, very tiny book. So the very first one is The Missing Girl. A young girl goes missing from a sort of Girl Scout science type camp, and no one can figure out what's happened to her. The second in this is Journey with a Lady, which is a young boy who's going on a train journey by himself for the first time. He's about 9 or 10, and he bumps into a mysterious woman. So the very last one in this is called Nightmare. This is the one that I have the most questions about, and again, like The Breakthrough, I wish was a full-length novel. It's about a young woman. She's working as a secretary in an office, and she has to go out and deliver a package, and something really strange begins to happen to her. So I ended up really enjoying these. The second one, The Journey with a Lady, I think was my favorite. It's definitely the least mysterious of them, which probably helps a little bit. It also has no sort of supernatural elements to it. I ended up really liking it. I feel like it wrapped up really nicely. So the other 2 in this volume, I think I took slightly more issue with because I did enjoy them, but I felt because those 2 stories were so short, I didn't really find it satisfying at all. It feels like it ends very abruptly, and I actually have no problem with books that have that very open to interpretation ending, but for whatever reason, these 2 just didn't do it for me. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars because I did really enjoy it. I felt like it could have been a little bit better for me. So next up on the list is my audiobook read for this month. So this is Robert Galbraith's The Silkworm. We all know that Robert Galbraith is J.K. Rowling, so I'm going to say her instead of him when I'm talking about the author. So this is the follow-up book to The Cuckoo's Calling, which is the very first book in her crime series. So I thought that The Cuckoo's Calling was okay. I ended up enjoying this one much, much more. So The Silkworm is about a sort of not very famous literary writer who I think fancies himself to be a little bit more famous than he is, and he goes missing. So his wife calls in Cormoran Strike, who is our detective and our hero, to find him. And obviously, of course, because this is a Cormoran Strike book, that writer ends up dead. So I again, did the audiobook for this, which I thought was a really, really great choice. I thought the narrator was excellent, and I'm actually going to get the third book in the series on audiobook as well, because he's so, so good. He really differentiates the different characters by their accents and their voices, and he also is really good with that kind of thriller pacing when he's reading this book. So regarding the actual plot and characters, I did end up enjoying this much more than Cuckoo's Calling, which I did like. I thought that it was a much tighter plot. I thought it was a much more interesting plot, and I really loved the sort of crazy characters that you get. I thought that the development of the relationship between Cormoran Strike and Robin and the sort of level of respect that they have for each other was really wonderful, and I thought it was really, really good. I really liked this. I believe I gave this 4, maybe even 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is my literary fiction read of the month. I'm telling you, I read so many just different genres this month. This is actually a review copy from Sandstone Press, so thank you so much for sending this to me. This is The Accidental Recluse, and this is by Tom McCulloch. So just full disclosure, I am actually going to be hosting the launch event with Tom for this book in Oxford on the 18th of April. So if you're in town and you want to come along, it's a free event. It's going to be at the Westgate Centre. So I don't read a lot of literary fiction. It's not like it's a genre that I don't enjoy. I tend to lean more towards genre fiction over literary fiction. However, I found this book to be incredibly well paced. It was really interesting, and I absolutely tore through it. I think that this is a good place to start with literary fiction if you're worried about sort of the pacing and the accessibility of it. So this book follows Johnny Jackson, or JJ, and he is in his 70s, and he has sort of lived through this crazy period of entertainment history. He is Scottish, and his family, his brother Duke, and his father were all involved in kind of the music hall scene in the UK. And brother Duke is a very, very handsome man, and he becomes sort of the golden boy leading man. He ends up taking a lot of the credit for accomplishments that Johnny himself has, and he ends up marrying the woman that Johnny himself is in love with. So a lot of this book is flashback to that period in time, but a lot of it is also in the present day, where Johnny is sort of a recluse living in Japan, and he is doing his sort of final big film, which is a movie about Robert the Bruce. So he has to go back to Scotland, to his hometown, and sort of face his past. I really enjoyed this book. It's a really sort of in-depth character study of Johnny himself. He's almost an unreliable narrator in the way that he reacts to the things that have happened to him and the way that he reacts to things that are happening now. But under all of this, you can really see how these events of his past have affected him. I really ended up enjoying this book. I think that it's one that I might not have necessarily picked up on my own, but I'm really, really glad that I read. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. So the last novel that I read this month is a review copy from Gallant, so thank you so much to Gallant for sending this to me. I really loved this book unexpectedly. I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and it sort of came out of nowhere. So this is Planetfall by Emma Newman. I've never read anything by Emma Newman before, so I don't know how this compares to her other stuff, but there's something about this character and the way that she wrote this book that was just phenomenal. So Planetfall is a book that I think really tricked me into believing that it was going to be a standard sci-fi novel. The story is told in the first person by Renata, who is an engineer on this sort of team of colonists who have gone to this new planet to establish a colony and try to find God. So the book takes place about 22 years after the establishment of this colony on this planet. And it's a planet where there's no other human life. However, one day a man stumbles into the colony. So what I really loved about this book is the plot is almost secondary to this character and her experiences. This book happens to be really, really good for mental health rep. I'm not going to say exactly what because it's kind of spoilery, but the way that Emma Newman really nails anxiety, I thought was absolutely brilliant, especially as someone who does have anxiety at kind of a low level. I thought that the way that she tackles things like panic attacks, was really, really brilliant. I hesitate to compare this to the Becky Chambers Wayfarer novels because it's not alike in any way, shape, or form. However, it does still have that almost cozy feeling to it. It's a very, very tense novel, but it's also a very, very quiet novel. I think that this is one that could really slip through the cracks for a lot of people, but if you've seen it, you should absolutely pick it up because I thought it was just fantastic. There's not much more I can say without spoilers. I'm actually thinking of doing a spoilery review to just talk about this book a little bit more because it really blew my expectations out of the water. I ended up giving this, obviously, 5 out of 5 stars. So the last 2 books that I ended up reading this month are graphic novels, and I haven't finished the series, so I don't think I can really form much of an opinion on them yet. So this is Paper Girls by Brian K. Vaughan. So if you're not familiar with what Paper Girls is about, it's about 4 girls from 1988, I believe, and they're on their paper route, normal stuff, and then all of a sudden, sci-fi happens, essentially. So they end up being zapped into 2016. They're caught in the middle of this sort of time war. So I've only read the first 2 books. I believe 4 are out now. The library has a 3rd one. I don't know if it has the 4th one, but I really want to finish these up before I can really form an opinion. The first one is a lot of setup, and the second one really gets the story going. So I feel like I've just only dipped my toe into the water for these. I did really like them. I really liked the characters. I felt like sort of the dynamic between these 4 girls was really wonderful, and I'm really excited to see where these go next. I ended up giving these both about 3.5 out of 5 stars because, again, I just feel like I don't have an opinion on them yet because I feel like I've read like the first 20 pages of a book. Hey, future Justine here. I totally forgot to mention one of the books that I read this month, and the reason for that is because it was one of my NetGalley digital arcs. So I have this on my Kindle. I don't have it in a physical version, so I just completely forgot about it. So the NetGalley book that I read this month was The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, and this is by Stuart Turon. So if you haven't heard about this book, it's one that's kind of making some waves. It has, I would show you if I had it, but it has this beautiful kind of black and red and gold Art Deco cover, and it was described as Groundhog's Day meets Gosford Park, which are 2 of my favorite things. I was super excited to read this book, and I'm really glad that I did. The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle revolves around this sort of party that's going to be happening at this kind of crumbling country manor. So Evelyn is the only daughter of the Hardcastle family. They're the ones that own this house. When the story opens, we have our main character, and he wakes up in the woods. He has no idea who he is, where he is, what's happening, and he hears a woman scream and a gunshot. So our story kind of takes off from there. So it's hard to explain exactly what happens without just reading the copy of the book to you, but basically this one character is going to solve the murder of Evelyn that happens at 11 o'clock at night on the night that he has woken up in the woods. So every day he is actually in the body of a different guest. So the first day he's in the body of the doctor, the next day he's in the butler's body, and it goes on and on from there. It's incredibly cleverly done. You really have no idea who the murderer is or what's really going on until the last pages of the book. I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was just so fun and so enjoyable, and I really liked sort of getting all of the pieces together and seeing how he's going to help his future hosts out as he inhabits their bodies later on. So he can see the effects that his future self has on his present self. That sounds so like weird, but it really works out very well. I ended up giving this book 4 out of 5 stars. The reason it wasn't a 5-star book is because, without any spoilers, to try to keep it kind of vague, the whole reason that this is happening, this kind of weird, almost supernatural thing is happening, I was not sold on. I did not like it. I also didn't really like the ending of the book. Not so much the kind of wrapping up of this murder mystery, but how the narrative of what's going on behind the scenes wraps up. I'm not going to say anything more because everything is going to be so spoilery, but I highly recommend this book regardless. Those last bits just didn't really work for me, but overall this book was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. So that is it for March. Those are all the books I read in March. This is a really long video and I apologize for that, but I wanted to talk about each of them and give them their due. So I'm going to be doing my March book haul next, which is going to be even longer because I acquired a lot of books despite not wanting to acquire a lot of books, and a lot of that is my own fault. So if you're interested in seeing what I got in March, definitely stay tuned for the next video. If you have read any of these books, then definitely let me know. I would love to hear what you thought about them. If any of them are in your TBR, if you're interested in picking any of them up, I'd love to hear from you. So that is it for now, and I will see you next time.